Session. Really delighted to have you all joining us today. I'd like to hand over to Michael Marks from LGIM to open today's session. Over to you, Michael.
Hello, thanks, Matt. Welcome everybody to this session, which I'm really excited about. I'm really delighted to be here along with LGBT Great and with Global Butterflies. I'm really pleased that everyone's joined us. I'm the L&G executive sponsor for our LGBT plus network or employee resource group. I'm not sure what we will all settle on as the names for these things going forward. And I'm a member of Legal and General Investment Management's executive committee. I know I've been privileged enough to listen to talks from Global Butterflies before, and I know that around our whole community, I certainly make mistakes. I'm sure we all make mistakes from time to time. I might use the wrong phrase or say something unintentional. If I do, it wasn't meant to cause offense, and please forgive me. And if I do so today, please forgive me. I'm always learning, and that's actually why I'm thrilled that we're doing this event today on Transgender Day of Visibility. I think it's so important. It's really important to L&G. I think it's really important to all of us. We're all on a journey. At an L&G perspective, we want L&G, and I'm sure other workplaces similarly, we want L&G to be a welcoming space where everyone is able to be themselves and unafraid to bring their whole identity to work. We've undertaken a huge amount of work over the last couple of years, led by a phenomenal team across L&G, looking at a range of things, including our HR policies and things like that, to make sure it's all non-discriminatory. But having done all of that, that's, to me, groundwork. That doesn't make you necessarily a welcoming organization or make you welcoming people. But there are things that we're doing well. I think most of us recognize that it's become easier to be accepted and to be open about being LBG. Not to say that there's not further to go, because we still unfortunately witness all sorts of experiences that are not what we'd want them to be. But I think it's much harder for trans and non-binary people. And it still seems to be much harder for that part of our community to be authentically themselves at work. All of us have a responsibility to learn more, to try and understand more and be supportive without prying into anyone's personal identity. And I think that's the challenge I find myself in sometimes, is how do I do that? How do I help people, but without actually stepping into a space that they're going to find uncomfortable? So I'm here to learn today and do my part. I'm sure everyone who's joined today is here to support or be supported. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Matt and Jack.
Super, thank you, Michael, for that brilliant introduction. And hopefully what we can sort of bring today to this session is some interesting sort of statistics and awareness around key sort of transgender and non-binary issues, but also to really sort of celebrate the fantastic transgender people within our industry as well. So we're going to be looking at sort of a number of different things. I know we're going to have a really interesting conversation with the CEO of Global Butterflies, Reese, where we're going to look at sort of corporate allyship and some of the lived experience actually of being a transgender person in the world at the moment. We're then going to sort of build in a conversation with Dion Pillay, Head of Marketing Operations from LGIM, to talk about sort of some of the work and the specifics of the progress that's been made within their organisation as well. So for those of us, those of you who are new today to perhaps haven't joined one of these sort of sessions before, my name is Matt Cameron. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I really want to encourage you all today to sort of join us on social media. And some of you will know that actually visibility for us is a real sort of key strategic theme. So let's get visible, and you can join us today on Twitter using the social media handle LGBT Great, hashtag Project 1000, hashtag TDOV. Now, before we sort of move any further, we'd like to get all of you thinking, actually. So if I could ask my brilliant colleague Nahid to launch the first poll today. I'd like to invite you all to sort of pop your thoughts through and vote for which you think is the correct answer. So Nahid, if you could launch the first poll. So we've got, when was Transgender Day of Visibility founded? So we've got a number of votes sort of coming in here. So fantastic engagement today. So thank you, everybody. Give you a few more seconds to cast your votes. These are changing. We're very close from what I can see here. So we've got 67% of you who have voted so far. So we'll give it a few more seconds. But it'll be interesting to see what comes through. A few final votes sort of coming in there. But I think it's been really great to see actually the support of, I guess, visible advocating for this day from our industry this year, which has been really great to see from lots of different firms, both here within the UK, but also in sort of the US and APAC as well. Great, if you could sort of close the poll for me, Nahid, and let's see what the results are telling us. So I hope you can see that there in front of you. So I guess majority 35% are saying for 2014, closely followed by 29% who are saying 2009. So I can confirm that the correct answer is actually 2009. I know Jack's going to talk a little bit about how the date got started and how it sort of developed really from 2009 onwards. So thank you all for that. So I guess in terms of what you can expect today, we talked a little bit about sort of the agenda items before. We're aiming to sort of finish on time today. We would like to invite you all, and you can see Nahid and Jack are sort of actively talking on the chat function here, and please do share the points that resonate with you today in the chat function. We've also got the Q&A function as well, and we will be taking sort of questions quite sort of interactively throughout the session today. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the points that resonate with you. I guess for our new friends and partners, I just wanted to give you a very quick 30-second snapshot into LGBT Great, but we essentially specialise in driving the sort of D&I agenda across the industry, focusing on these three key areas here, which you can see. I guess the interventions such as this today really fit within our insights work to really help improve awareness of LGBT plus issues within the industry. So really delighted that you're joining us today on sort of event series. We do represent a broad range of different organisations, which you can see here, some of which you can see here, and very much a lot of our sort of interventions and training is delivered globally as well. So I know we've got quite a few colleagues on the line today from the States, and I know we've got some people who have stayed a little bit later as well in APAC to join this session as well. So we really do appreciate you sort of dialing in today. One of the things I wanted to draw to your attention, so for those of you who are here in the UK, maybe familiar with charity just like us, and there was some really interesting data which came out of one of their reports just this morning. I wanted to highlight this to all of you, because I think it's a really clear evidence as to the changing attitudes and increasing consciousness around gender identity amongst our young people. But the latest report has basically said that the majority, 96% of young people said that they will support a friend who came out as trans, and more than half of young people, 57% at secondary schools, say that they have a friend who is transgender. So we really are seeing a lot more sort of awareness around the transgender and non-binary identity within the young people. Rachel's going to talk about some of the data points later on, but another sort of stat that I wanted to really share with you today is that around 12% of millennials don't see gender identity as a fixed binary, and this came out of a Global Butterflies report in partnership with Lloyd's of London a few years ago. So approximately 4% of the workforce. So some really interesting and compelling reasons as to why our industry needs to support its transgender and non-binary talent more so. I know we wanted to quickly talk about gender identity, but first, before we get into that, I'd like to sort of launch a second poll with you now, just very quickly. And the question here is, how many different gender identities have been recorded within the LGBT community? And Nahid, if I could ask you just to sort of open the second poll, let's see what people think on this question. So how many different identities have been recorded within the LGBT community? Not question, sorry, all voting coming through, which is fantastic. Brilliant.
I always think we should have some deliberation music when we're hosting the poll.
Yeah, we should. Maybe
theme or
down the theme tune, Jack.
Yeah. Should I hum something or?
Yeah. Well, let the votes come through. Then, Jack, I'll let you sort of announce the results of this before you move into sort of helping us to understand a bit more about the gender identity spectrum.
Sure. Okay. So, Nahid, if we could close that there, I think most people have voted. Okay, so it looks like, yeah, the majority of people, 51%, saying over 25 but less than 50 different identities, and then 27% less than 25 and 22% over 50. The correct answer is actually over 50. I think what this really shows is the real diversity of identities within the LGBT plus community. And before we get into talking about some of the kind of history of transgender visibility, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of those concepts. And Matt mentioned a little bit earlier about, you know, gender being outside of the binary. We really wanted to kind of give a bit of a insight into what we mean by that. So when we've thought historically, you know, our thinking about gender has been, we would describe as quite binary. So you imagine there's male and there's female, and a person is either one or the other. But as our thinking has started to evolve, we've seen it less as you know, a binary and more as kind of a spectrum. You have male on one side and you have female on the other, and a person could identify all the way on one side, but also their identity could be somewhere in the middle. Maybe it's smack bang in the middle, maybe it's a little bit more on one side. And actually, as our thinking has evolved, and certainly the way that I think a lot of young people are perceiving gender at the moment is less as a kind of straight line spectrum, but more as a kind of much broader, different kind of spectrum. So you have male in one place, you have female in another, and there is a whole host of other identities, you know, in between them, but also around them and outside of them. There's a few different terms that are kind of coming up on the screen now. And this is just an example of some of the different identities that are within the LGBT plus community. I know we don't necessarily have all of the time to go through all of them today, but there are a lot of different ways that people can identify. And actually there's a comment that's just come through in the chat that says the gender binary is only traditional in, that is a colonial concept, and gender fluidity existed far before the binary did. Actually, I think that's a really important point to remember. One thing that I often like to draw attention to is a Native American concept called two-spirit, which was people who identified with traits of both masculine and feminine, sort of similar to what we might consider as transgender. And I think actually what's important to remember is that whilst these terms, transgender and non-binary, we might be hearing them for some of the first times, but actually these concepts and these ways of identifying have existed for just as long as people have existed in the world. But let's get into a few definitions. So transgender, first of all, so this would refer to someone whose gender identity is different to the sex assigned at birth. What does that mean? Well, you know, when a baby is born and the doctor looks at it and says it's a boy or it's a girl, that's an example of sex being assigned at birth. And in most cases, the child might be raised with that gender in mind, as they would be treated as a boy or as a girl. But as that person is growing up, they might start to think, well, actually, this doesn't feel quite right. You know, I think I'm different, and I think my gender identity is a little bit different to this. And they might choose to, later on in life, express that gender and live their life as a different gender identity. Another term that we're using here is non-binary, and this would refer to someone whose gender identity is neither male nor female. So if you think back to that image we showed previously, you would think about non-binary as perhaps it's someone who's in the middle somewhere between male and female, but also perhaps it's someone who's outside of that male-female kind of spectrum. And I think what's important to remember is that both these terms are quite broad and actually could encompass a lot of different identities. And I think one other thing to kind of bring in is that gender identity is very unique to the individual. You know, a person's gender identity is not something that we can ever assume. You know, we might naturally make assumptions and based on what we see of people, but actually it's until that person shares their gender identity with you that you can really know for sure. And I would really encourage everyone to kind of come at this with an open mind and really kind of space to learn, particularly if it's something that you've not quite come across before. Next thing we wanted to do is talk through a little bit of a timeline of kind of modern transgender history, and as the comment said before, a lot of these concepts of transgender have existed for a lot longer than this. But if we look back at, you know, over the last 70 years or so, 1951 was the first recorded case in the UK of a person undergoing gender reassignment surgery or gender affirmation surgery, as it's sometimes called, and that was the racing driver Roberta Cowell. And actually the term transgender, which we often use very commonly today, was only popularised in the late 1960s by a lot of different authors, including Virginia Finch, who was another trans woman. And as we kind of move forward, we've started to see transgender rights kind of coming to the fore, particularly through the examples of legal protections. Of course, and we'll talk a little about this later, but there are instances where people are discriminated against based on their gender identity, amongst a lot of other things. And we've seen more and more consciousness around protections being put into place. And 1996 is one that I want to draw attention to. It was the first recorded ruling of a trans person being unfairly dismissed from the workplace based on their gender identity, which I think was a real turning point. 2009, of course, we saw Transgender Day of Visibility itself being founded, as we said earlier. It was founded by an activist called Rachel Crandall, who really wanted to increase the awareness of trans people and really spotlight and celebrate their achievements. It was sort of also created as a bit of a kind of pushback against a lot of the challenges that trans people face. And actually, it doesn't all have to be doom and gloom, but let's celebrate the lives of trans people and really support them. And we've seen, particularly over the last 10 years, more and more protections being put in place. Of course, the 2010 UK Equality Act protects transgender people based on their gender identity. And we actually saw in the US last year a Supreme Court ruling that the Civil Rights Act also does protect transgender and non-binary people based on their gender identity. So I think what we've seen is a real push to consciousness of support needed for transgender and non-binary people over the last 70 or so years. And I think a lot of that has come from the visibility really of people in history. It's through the kind of bravery and the coming forth of those people like Roberta Cowell to kind of stand forward and be counted, that really we've been able to achieve that. And I think it really just speaks to the power of visibility and the importance of it. Matt, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add there.
Yeah, I think what this shows is that there's been a real sort of looks to be a real progression actually when we talk about transgender and non-binary identities. But I know one of the challenges, of course, is that there are so many challenges, and I know Rachel's going to talk a little bit about some of these that we're sort of experiencing today. But it is a fact that trans and non-binary people face significant issues within their life because of sheer virtue of their identity. So really important actually that we do create that visibility, and the whole point I think around Transgender Day of Visibility is that we really take a moment to reflect and also to sort of really recognise the fantastic people that are in our society and in our businesses and in our lives. And I know we're doing a lot of work around this at the moment because I think within our industry, Jack as well, we see a lot of work around sexual orientation, particularly led by the G, meaning gay men within the industry, but actually much less of a consciousness around what gender identity is. And because of that, and I know again this is a point that we're going to talk about later, that fear of not knowing how to have the conversation. And I can see, from the questions that are coming through as well, we've got some fantastic people here around actually how do we have that conversation? How do we really navigate that? And I know Rachel talks about corporate allyship, sure. She's going to be sort of giving some, practical examples as well of what we can do to open these conversations in a really, really curious way that gets people in, talking about some of the issues that we're talking about here. So I think that would be it from me, Jack, on those sort of particular points. But I know one of the areas that we're keen to talk about before we move on to the discussion with Rachel is really the uphill climb that we've got actually in terms of recognition for transgender and non-binary people as well. And share with us, Jack, your thoughts on what you think sort of this visual is sort of saying to us. What was this telling us?
Yes, you can see from the visual here that there's a large number of countries in the world that still don't recognise non-binary identities. So what that means is that legally, you think about on your passport or something like that, a person is only able to identify as male or female in those countries, which means that for those people that do identify outside of that, they're not able to be fully recognised as who they are. And I think what this really shows, one of the points that came through in the chat is what's next? What's the next thing that needs to be achieved? Is it something legal or something else? I think what we see from this, and there's another image we'll show in a second, I think what this shows is that actually there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to raise awareness about some of these concepts. And whilst we might be starting to make progress, of course, that's great, and it's really important to recognise that and celebrate that. I think there is still work to be done, and I think a lot of it is around awareness and education. Like you said, Matt, a lot of what we hear is that people aren't quite sure how to have the conversation, or aren't quite sure how to ask the questions.
Yes.
And I think actually we need to open up space for people to have those conversations. I think there was another question that came through around what measures and initiatives have been successful in creating more inclusive environments, and I would say actually it's creating open spaces for the discussion to be had, and really allowing people to ask those questions in a safe way, and not feel like if I say the wrong thing, I'm going to be victimized or called out and shamed for it. But actually, like we saw earlier, there are so many different identities within the LGBT plus community. But actually, I'm still learning about them too. Like Michael said at the start, we're all still learning. And actually, by allowing people that space to learn, I think it can make a real difference. We can see as well for this image, there's what countries allow you to legally change your gender identity. But in a lot of those countries, even where you are still able to change your identity, it still is within that male-female binary. So I think there is still work to be done across the world, and even in places like the UK and the US that might be more open to some of these concepts than other places. There is still work to be done.
Yes, I completely agree, Jack. I was thinking it might be a good point at this stage, just checking on the chat function, see any questions that we've got coming through, or anything on the Q&A function. Anything that you want to sort of answer on there, Jack?
Yeah, there was one that came through. I know Dion's typed an answer to, so thanks for that. But just wanted to read it out just in case. What does cisgender mean? Just heard the word cis being used. Cis is just a sort of shortened version of cisgender, and like Dion says, it's when a person's gender identity matches the sex assigned at birth. So I'm an example of this. When I was born, the doctor said it's a boy, and I identify as male, so I am cisgender. And I think actually it's really important to kind of bring that out and highlight that we all have a gender identity. For a lot of people, that might be cisgender, but actually we've often thought historically about trans and non-binary as the other. It's the odd one out, the strange way of identifying, but actually it's just a different way. And actually, if we view it as we all have a gender identity, it could often help to allow people to understand that concept a little bit more. Just checking through the questions as well. There was one around, is there a right way to ask the question around someone's gender identity? And I think what I would say is what's important is not necessarily asking the question to people directly, but giving them the space to share with you as much as they want. If you're going to kind of ask someone how they identify, it might, for some people, put them on the spot a little bit. They might not quite feel ready to share that part of who they are. But there are ways to kind of understand how to interact with people in the best way. So a really great example of that is sharing your own identity to kind of show that you're open to the conversation. You might often see in a lot more email signatures, people putting their pronouns in their email signatures. I know a few of us have done that in our Zoom names as well today. And it's just a really great way to show that you're thinking about those kind of things and open to having a discussion. And you might find from that people then are kind of more open to then sharing their identity with you. It's also a really great question to ask. What are your pronouns? It's a perfectly respectful question to ask, and it's a really great way to make sure that you're referring to people in the right way that they want you to.
Great, thank you, Jack, for that. So let's move on to sort of talking a little bit about our announcement for today, which is pretty exciting. So we've got another quick minute for you before we bring in Rachel there for sort of conversation with us. But essentially, what we'd like to tell you all today is that we are actually going to be putting together a guide, an industry guide, that really breaks down some of the trans and non-binary language, the terminology, along with some tips in there as well of how we can really think about activating more corporate allyship, and actually some specific things that Project 1000 role models as well can really do to help build these conversations and increase that sort of consciousness around gender identity. So we're going to be working on this from really the start of April through to the end of the year, and launching this in November. We're going to be sort of working closely on Rachel with this as well to make sure we get everything right. So really excited to sort of be bringing this. And one of the sort of the asks that we wanted to invite you all to think about today is that if you'd like to be involved in any way, whether it's, you know, contributing role models from your organisation, or actually involved in some of the work that we're going to be doing on the project, then please do sort of get in touch with us. You know, you can email in, you know, directly at info@lgbtbreak.com, and we'll also be sending out an email after this as well, with a way for you to get in touch. Secondly, our other ask of everybody today is to really think about using personal pronouns, a really great way to normalise conversations about gender identity. And sort of finally, you know, really do think about becoming a visible ally, you know, for trans and non-binary people, sort of within our industry. And we'd be delighted to sort of talk to you a bit about Project 1000 and some of the actions that you can take internally to help sort of move this sort of narrative on. I guess without sort of further ado, Rachel, really good to have you sort of with us today. There we go, we can see and hear you. It's a good start. How are you?
Well, I'm very well, thank you. Yes, a little bit tired. You know, as we're probably going to talk about, I'm very honest with people and say that actually my mental health has been suffering over lockdown. There's been a lot of rise in transphobia in the UK, and we run a trans inclusion business. So you have to be on social media, you have to interact. And of course, that makes you a bit of a target. So mental health, not great, not sleeping, but I'm still here and I'm really glad to be here today.
And we're very pleased to have you. But why don't we start off and just tell everyone, because I know there's some people that, you know, have not joined one of our sessions before, but it'd be great, bit of an intro on you and actually, you know, the work of Global Butterflies, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, my background is I was a software engineer in the 80s during the Cold War. I moved into HR, got to know people and processes, and got an interest in law because I spent so much time in employment tribunals. So I went to law school in the 90s, came out with my legal practice course, tried to get a job as a trans woman and couldn't get a job in the legal sector. So I went back into the closet, came back out in male expression, got a job at the University of Law where I trained to be a solicitor. And there weren't really great signs and signals that I was looking for that I'd be safe. And that's what all trans and non-binary people look for in organizations, that it's going to be a good place to work and I'm going to be safe and thrive. But I got to the point where so many of us, it gets to that sort of dark moment of, I don't want, you know, I'm worried about transitioning. You start to get depressed. That, you know, I had a lot of suicidal thoughts. So I thought I would tell the organization. And actually, this is 20 years ago. They were really great. And it did come down to a lot of project management, respect, and lots of communication. And I thrived at the University of Law, and I worked up to their production director. But I left in 2015. Because the legal sector was a bit sucky, trans inclusion wise, non-binary inclusion wise. We didn't have great visibility. So Global Butterflies was formed to do trans and non-binary inclusion training in the legal sector. Emma Custin, my fiance and partner, joined 3 years ago, and we moved into the insurance, banking, investment, marketing, advertising, and now we're all business sectors. We don't work outside business because all the people in Global Butterflies have only ever worked in corporate companies. So we know what it's like to get left behind in those organizations. And we're in our 6th year now, and still here.
Yeah, well, as ever, we're delighted to be sort of collaborating on this again this year. I know obviously we collaborated on the Quilter event last year, which I can't believe that was a year ago now.
I know, how quickly that's gone.
Alone, hasn't it? And I just want to say, thank you as well, just, for sharing, about how you are at the moment, because I know we've had a lot of conversations about how tough it is, being a transgender person at the moment. And I'm just wondering whether we could perhaps start off with, some of the data points around trans and non-binary people. So I know you've got loads of those.
Yeah, so I mean, it was only 6 years ago in the UK that organisations were saying, there are only 12,000 people in the UK that are trans, and they weren't even mentioning non-binary, and they were saying, well, we don't have to do anything, and if we have a trans person, we'll buy a lottery ticket. but actually GIRES in 2016 did a survey for the Women Equalities Committee and said actually 1% of the population could be on the gender identity spectrum. So 1 in 100 clients, 1 in 100 of your workforce. So maybe maybe think of something. Maybe you should be doing something. European Union. Do you remember Europe? It was good, wasn't it? I really enjoyed Europe. Well, Europe said 4% on the gender identity spectrum. 4% of your clients, 4 in 100 of your workforce. So that really means you should be doing something. The current workforce is the millennial generation. 12% are on the gender identity spectrum. So you've already got those people in your workforce right now. And the wonderful Gen Z, the Gen Z I love, going to pay my pension, fix the climate, put us back in Europe. Well, Gen Z, 20% of Gen Z identify as being non-binary. And 50% of them do not see gender as being binary. Now that is worth taking note. 1 in 5 of your workforce are going to be probably non-binary. So you need to get it right. You need to get your systems and processes right, because you don't want to upset 1/5 of your workforce, because that's going to wash across to the rest of your workforce. And your clients are going to see, are going to demand more of you as organizations. If 50% of your clients do not see gender as binary, and you're being a very binary in your processes, systems, and the way you sell or the way you work with the public, well, that's going to lose you business.
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely, and that really resonates with me actually, because I do a lot of talking to universities, for example, and we're seeing a lot more students now start to get involved in LGBT networks. And one of the conversations having recently with a student from my old university, University of Birmingham, shameless shout out, and they were actually telling me about all of the things that they were looking for when actually deciding where to go and work as a transgender person. And I was like, wow, those expectations are quite high. It's thinking, I guess for them they're not high because it's kind of the norm, but actually thinking about what I know in terms of where organizations are, there's a huge gap in terms of the expectations of young people versus where businesses currently are at the moment. I guess that takes us on to sort of the next question really around the longer term benefits of getting transgender and non-binary inclusion right. What would you say that are the key points?
Well, I mean, I would say first, short term, better health, mental health for your trans and non-binary employees right now. Yes. I always say that organizations, if they're good to their trans and non-binary employees, then they're good to everybody. Because it's often the last characteristic that organizations get to, and if they're doing that well, they're doing everything else well, in my view. But if you're getting it right, then you're going to have a happier workforce as a result of that, because we have a lot of allies in the workplace, and if an organization is truly being authentic when including and promoting and looking after their trans and non-binary employees, that does affect the whole workforce. And the fact is that trans people, statistics say that we're educated, we're really good at project management. We have to project manage our changing gender expressions, our life. We're obviously really robust. There's an overlap with neurodiversity. I'm dyslexic, but that's my superpower. I have lots of other things that I'm absolutely brilliant at: project management, systems, processes. So there's, we are a really good employee resource. We know that a diverse, included workforce is good for business. We know that corporate social responsibility is good for business. So getting trans and non-binary inclusion is really, really good. And I always tell companies, well, how do right now it is horrible to be trans and non-binary in the UK, but some organizations are doing a lot, and we'll talk about this, I know, but a lot of companies are doing a lot of good work to include and look after us. And how do you want to be judged in 10 years time when all this has blown past, when Gen Z's in the workplace, governments have changed, and the world's a nicer place, I hope? Well, how do you want to be judged? Because LGBT community, we do have long memories and we do remember. So it's good to get it right now. Yeah,
no, I completely agree. I think, in 10 years time, there's going to be, the generations that you're talking about are going to be in our workforces, right?
Yes.
So I think around, getting this right is really critical when you talk about, future-proofing your business and being able to, attract a broad dimension of different, diverse backgrounds, different diversity dimensions. But the point you made on, if you get trans and non-binary inclusion right, it's kind of a, a litmus test for other forms of inclusion. And I've actually talked about that a lot, more broadly actually from the whole of the LGBT plus sort of spectrum. But I think the reason I think that is because, LGBT plus inclusion is, it is complex. It's tough conversations. It's an area that most people probably haven't really had that conversation about before. And actually, we have to work really hard at, understanding the issues and the identities. But also, I think it's a conversation that you've got to keep having because things obviously change so much. I'm just thinking at that point, and Jackie, can we just see if we've got any sort of questions or points coming through the chat function just before we continue the conversation? Anything you want to raise?
Sure, there's actually one that's come up. Is there an organisation in the UK or worldwide that you think is really illustrating and leading on the agenda? I don't know whether, Rachel, if you've got any examples that you've worked with, or Matt, anything you'd like to add.
That is I can tell you about the sector. I would like to call out, because I think all organisations still have work to do on trans and non-binary inclusion. But I think the legal sector were leading this area for the last 3 years. They have been excelling. Right now, I would say that there's a bit of a stall in all sectors. And we'll talk about this again. I think the fact is that what we're seeing is either organizations are moving towards the guns no matter what. There are those who were really good, who've gone very quiet because they wanted to see how this battle of trans rights is going to end before they know which side of it that they want to be on. Again, that will be judged again in 10 years time. We'll look back and go, when we were getting trampled by government and legislation and discriminated against, you said nothing. So there are organizations that were really good and have gone very quiet. I think the legal sector is still moving forward, but I'm seeing a lot of traction in all sectors at the moment, which is really worrying. Some of our clients are really, really great still, and they're still moving forward. But I think there's a general unease at the moment, and because especially those who've got clients who buy products, because the clients, a lot of the people that are anti-trans are their clients as well. So I can tell organizations that the LGBT, the trans and non-binary community outnumber the gender critical movement, and you're safe by including us because it's good business and you'll thrive. But a lot of them are sitting a bit on the fence at the moment, and that makes me very sad.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I think it's been good to see the legal sector. There's been a lot of visibility. Consistently, actually, I think.
Yes.
But actually, 10 years ago, there wasn't. So, a lot's been achieved in 10 years. I think that's a point of inspiration, is that perhaps other sectors like our industry, the investment, financial services sector, you can do a lot in a short space of time. Yeah. I think it's just being really clear on what some of those things are. But let's talk a bit about corporate allyship, Rachel. I know this is one of your subject matter expertise. But what do we mean by individual and sort of active allyship? Talk to us a bit about that.
Well, governments aren't very good at trans and non-binary inclusion. This current one isn't. Getting a bit political. Woo. But governments come and go, but corporates, I say, are forever, and they have great influence. I mean, they can influence governments and they can influence whole countries. So companies that aren't neutral on trans and non-binary inclusion have great power. And I think coming out of lockdown, a lot of organizations are looking about what are we going to be in the new world? Well, we have to work with climate, because if we're not going to be here. We know a diverse and included workforce is good business. What does that look like? And that means they have to have difficult conversations with themselves about their past and their history, about what they need to do to improve. And that's a lot of soul searching. We're moving from what I call corporate social responsibility to corporate social justice. So you are bringing in interested parties, like trans and non-binary people. You're looking at the things the mistakes you've made. You're looking at, and you make public commitments like, we're going to make 5% of our board trans and non-binary in the next 5 years. Make a stub, and then hold yourself to that. You have this power to write to governments. You pay taxes. The more big companies that write to governments and complain about the way they're treating trans and non-binary people, well, governments will listen to that eventually, because they're going to, they know that you're corporate players. You lobby MPs. You have that power. Obviously, making those internal statements internally, but absolutely looking outside to things like newspapers. Do you buy your board all the newspapers for them to read? Well, don't buy the ones that advertise write anti-trans articles. In fact, cancel all your subscriptions and tell those newspapers why. So that's really good. Where does your brand get advertised? If you're advertising, your logo is appearing in magazines and publications, and there are about 80% of the articles written in the UK are negative to trans and non-binary people, well, pull your brand and find newspapers and advertisers and television outlets who report trans and non-binary stories in a positive light. So you have that power as well. And also there are, I'm not going to name them on this, but there are 2 or 3 very hateful anti-trans organizations who frame themselves as being very supportive in the LGB space, and write to government and write to companies. Well, just publicly tell the world what you think of those organizations, because a lot of organizations are doing that. And that sends such a strong signal to trans and non-binary people that you are including us, and that the challenges that we're facing. Yeah,
I completely agree. Actually, at this point around collective voice, and I often talk about our industry flexing its muscle, right? When we think about investments and where we invest our money, whether it's in countries or in organizations, we do have, and we've seen some good leadership actually on some of these issues. State Street Global Advisors have recently talked about withholding voting for companies that don't disclose race, ethnicity on board. We've seen some similar points coming out of the US government as well. President Biden saying, or threatening to say, if countries do not protect LGBT plus people with legislation, potentially they could be financial sanctions. There's big things like this that can really make a difference. And I guess an example would be, obviously here in the UK, this whole conversation about banning conversion therapy, which is just a completely ridiculous. It should just be done. But of course, I guess what we did at LGBT Great was to get all of our members and all of our communities to write in to the MP, and between us all, not just LGBT Great, we're a tiny part of it, but with everybody in businesses really standing up as a collective voice. And actually, we saw quite a quick climb down on some of the things that the Equality Minister was saying. So I guess corporate allyship really key. Is there any other specific things that you think executive sponsors can be thinking about when we talk about corporate allyship?
Well, executive sponsors just need to be talking about the subject, because many aren't. We look after lots of people who transition or change their gender expression in the workplace, and they tell us the only reason they've done that, when they decided to do it in many cases, is because their senior leader spoke about the subject. Believe you me, a lot of our trans and non-binary friends assume if you don't talk about this subject, you're not okay with it. So you do need that senior leadership, just even talking about it, coming to ally meetings, LGBT meetings, marching in Pride. It sends the strongest signal down into your organization, and things will start to happen because you're giving networks the power to feel free to influence. But you do need that senior leadership to say something. It just doesn't happen otherwise.
Yeah, I heard a good comment a couple of weeks ago from an executive that I was talking to. And they were talking about the power of mentoring. We're launching a mentoring program. But mentoring happens when you're in the room, but actually sponsorship happens when you're outside of the room.
Yeah, that's good.
Which has really resonated with me. I thought actually, because corporate executive sponsors do obviously have the ability to influence and to help others. So that really was quite powerful when I heard that. I know we've got a few other points that we want to talk about, Rachel, but I really want to bring Dion in actually. So let's stay on the line, and Jack, you're here as well to be involved in this dialogue as well. But there we go. We can see lovely Dion. Hi, Dion.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for having me. Hi, Rachel. Lovely to see you again.
Thank you for joining. But I know you've obviously been involved in, I guess as chair for a long time, LNG, the network there. But talk to us a little bit about some of the work that your organisation has been doing around its trans and non-binary inclusion journey, and where did you get started?
Really interesting, Matt. It was actually Rachel who inspired lots of this. I remember we were going to an event and watching Rachel speak about the trans community and the challenges. And I thought, as the chair of the network, what can I be doing to make an impactful difference in the organization? And it's so great people like Michael Marks, who's our exec sponsor. We spoke about our policies and, Michael played a really big role in sort of getting the right people in the room to talk about policy. As part of the whole policy review, we recognized that we are missing a trans inclusion, and sort of making sure that non-binary identities also was included in that policy. And we started to sort of draft our policy, but what we were really careful about was making sure that this policy included the trans community, it had their voice to it. Because very often people go in and draft a policy because that's what HR do, they draft a policy, right? But we're actually consulting the right people. Yeah. I think Global Butterflies played a key role in our policy. I remember they sort of did consultation for us together with Stonewall and the union. And it was really, really important for us because, as you know, lots of people who identify as non-binary or trans are not always open at work because they're fearful of discrimination. And therefore, even those individuals within our business wouldn't come forward and help shape those policies, because coming forward meant outing themselves, right? And it's not fair to ask them to do that. So we're really grateful that we're having a conversation again a couple of years later with the Global Butterflies. And I remember, very importantly, it was actually at our own event internally with the Global Butterflies, we were talking about trans inclusion in the workplace, that on that evening, we found out that we were hiring somebody who also identified as trans, another person coming to the business. It was fantastic news for us, and very excited that our new policy was about to go live as well.
Yeah, no, really good. I think, key points to me there is around obviously being inspired to think about, okay, we need to do something, and that catalyst point. So I think, utilising external partnerships to help sometimes start those conversations. And the point you made around executive sponsor as well, and Michael's role and their role in getting people into the room and getting this onto the table. So I think that was some key points to me there. I guess in terms of sort of challenges, obviously, any sort of changes, with policy and at work is always a process. Tell us a bit about some of the obstacles and how did sort of the organisation get around those?
I think the one thing that most businesses don't think about is facilities. And it's such an important thing for the trans community. Everybody needs a place to go and to feel accepted. And if you don't have those right facilities to enable them to bring their whole selves to work, it does cause problems. And when you sort of have an old building, that has restrictions in certain places, it was overcoming that. And we had a great team internally who worked to that. And obviously part of the refurbishment of the building, they considered the trans and non-binary community and making sure those facilities would be included going forward. And I think, I was glad to see that has come to fruition. They've now changed some of the facilities to enable everyone to feel that they belong in our business. So that was sort of one of the small hurdles, I would say. What really surprised me was I didn't expect, the level of support, and I don't know why, because I work for a great organization, but just to see that momentum, how quickly we were able to get this policy in place was fantastic. So whilst you could say, a challenge, it was more sort of just great to see that momentum and the willingness from everybody to actually ensure that all our employees felt accepted. And that sort of resonates throughout, throughout all our policies. It's not just the trans and non-binary policy, but every single policy that the LGBT network have helped shape is inclusive of all minority communities as well.
Yeah, I think one of the things I've really noticed about LNG is there's such a range of different stakeholders across the business that are involved and engaged on the LGBT agenda. And a good example, the EXCO are constantly talking, obviously led by Michael, talking around LGBT plus inclusion. You've got a great comms team. I know you obviously, Dion, you're in, leader within the marketing department, but marketing and comms are really on board with this as well. And actually, we see some of the strongest advocacy consistently on social media, for example. HR, diversity, everybody's kind of on the journey on the same page. And I think it's a real team effort, and it's not an isolated sort of HR issue. It's a real collective effort, and that's been amazing to see, within your business, and actually the role of the executive sponsor and the network leaders in creating that space. Rachel, I know you've got to dash off for a 2 o'clock sort of keynote, but I really want to bring you in at this point, just to sort of build on this. Challenges that organisations face when they get started. Anything that you see regularly, and actually, how do you help organisations get around those obstacles?
So, I mean, the most important thing is that I mean, organizations sometimes do bits and they tell us, oh, we're not getting any trans and non-binary candidates applying, or we're not getting anybody transitioning or saying that they're there. And it does come down to this, and it's very simple. You can't bolt this on because we can see that. I've worked in organizations where I've seen them, you know, play lip service. It's got to be authentic. And the way you do that is by lots of little steps and often. So it does start with senior leadership. It does then go down to HR departments. We do so much training in HR because you've got to recruit, gender neutral recruitment, respectful recruitment, transition management, policy creation. That goes on to healthcare, employee assistance programs. That way, you've got to include middle managers because they can be a block. So make sure managers are educated and included and know why they've been included. And your frontline staff, security, venue services, reception, telephone, because to trans and non-binary people, they are your company when we come through your doors. So you've got to make it pervasive and it's got to feel authentic, because if it isn't, we'll see that. And it won't happen. And there are companies out there that do lots and lots of stuff. They do some of this stuff, but they still don't have trans and non-binary people. And you know, sometimes you just feel that something's a bit smelly there. There's something going on which we can't see, but you just know there's something missing in the authenticity of it. It's got to feel pervasive. It's got to feel real.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's got to resonate with, you know, with the business as well, right? And I think, you know, getting people on board that haven't, you know, had that gender identity conversation before. You know, I'm continually inspired actually by when you bring this topic, you know, to the conversation, the amount of questions and, you know, forthcoming interest actually in understanding it is amazing. And I've seen some really great moments on, you know, on training sessions. Of course, they're all virtual these days, but, you know, with CEOs in the industry that are having the gender identity live for the first time in front of everyone, and actually to see them go through that process and sometimes misgender or, you know, make assumptions, and actually see that process of making sometimes a mistake, but actually that's fine, you know, as long as it's coming from a good place. But I think, you know, being brave and almost being vulnerable a little bit to, you know, to tackle some of these questions, some of these conversations. You know, it's a way in which you can help people feel at ease, I think, you know, in learning about these things. I guess any sort of final points from you, Rachel, before you have to jump off?
Well, I just like the, you know, one of those things you can do is your what I call operational signaling. It's the concept that we do, which is, you know, that make sure that you know, in your recruitment processes, obviously your application form should have more than 2 genders on it. There should be trans and non-binary faces on your website when we're looking through your recruitment area. You should be living and breathing your own recruitment policy. You need to be setting up your systems that, you know, it does have, you know, as I say, a place for me to put my gender expression. Pull down menu has MX on it. You need to make sure your HR staff are trained. Your social media is inclusive when you're sending out messages, that your recruiters and your HR people have got pronouns on their signature boxes. This all sends great things. But I also like the reverse of that signaling is that you are showing that you're a diverse and included in an organization. And if you're a person who doesn't believe in that, this is not the organization for you to work in, because you don't want those people in your organization. You want people that are diverse and feel included, because you're going to have a much better R&D, a much happier workforce, and you're going to do really, really well. And you don't want people coming to your organization who aren't like that. So in a way, you want to prevent gender critical people not to apply to your organization, because I'm looking for a happy, clappy organization to work in.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, you know, really great points. Now, I like this point you make around we've got to equip, you know, HR and recruitment with tools that they need, the support that they need to understand the issues and actually implement some of these, you know, processes and systems that you talk about. Because I always say to, you know, our members that when a candidate goes into an interview, you know, it shouldn't be a case of having to talk about LGBT. They should just know when they're in there that actually the organisation you know, is supportive. You know,
absolutely.
And people managers, you know, when we talk about organisational signalling, and one of the things that I constantly talk about is, you know, these small little signals that we can create on social media, you know, support, whether it's sharing some of your posts or, you know, sharing some of, you know, diversity partnership, LGBT greats posts. It's a really easy way in which you can really demonstrate your support around sort of the agenda. But yeah, I'll let you sort of pop off. So I know you obviously you've got your 2 o'clock hard stop. You're a lady in demand, Rachel. But thank you very much for joining us today.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time to listen, and I'll see you all again very soon. Goodbye.
Thank you, Rachel. And let's go back to you, Dion. Obviously, you heard Rachel talk a little bit before about the rise of sort of transphobia in the UK, and I think in large parts of the world as well. I know you do a lot of work with, your role as, chair of Interinvest and, within the organisation as well at L&G. But what do you think corporates can do, to really combat some of the things that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I like what sort of Rachel said earlier on, and she talked about using your voting power and using the advocacy and speaking to government and sort of lobbying for this, because it's so important. But I think we need to take a step back, right? Let's fix it for the people that work for us, because we can all assume that we don't have trans and non-binary people working for us, which we know is a lie, right? We know that they are in our offices. We just don't know what they look like, because not every trans person looks the same. And therefore, we go about looking for people that we want to identify as trans. But equally, when somebody does come on as trans and shares that with us, it's not our right to start to out them and talk about them. That's really, really important. So I think starting off, before we start to fix the world problems, let's start internally by fixing our own internal problems. So making sure we have the right facilities for these individuals. We have strong policies internally, but not just policies that are sitting there on a shelf, policies that we're actively using every single day, right? So the policies that we've helped develop together with the Global Butterflies is an example of that. It talks about, this sort of discrimination and etc. like in there. It also helps managers understand the process of what transitioning may look like for the individual, because each individual's transitioning process is slightly different. Some people may go for a gender reassignment, others may choose not to do that. So it's understanding those nuances. But equally, when the person's coming back into the office again, it's what's the process look like for that individual, because it is an individual person's choice. And when they return to work, each person is unique in how they return. So it's making sure you tailor those conversations and how you inform the rest of the team by equally consulting with the person returning to work, right?
Yes.
The other part you spoke about was sort of pronouns. And again, everyone sort of says, oh, if it's a trans individual, therefore it's they and them. And no, it's not true. You got to make sure you ask, what are your pronouns? Because we know some people who are non-binary, on certain days, they may choose to be he and him or she and her. On other days, they may say, actually, no, I'm they and them. So it's always polite, and the right thing to do is to ask the person, what is your gender pronoun, or what pronoun should I use when talking to you?
Yeah.
And then taking that a step further, if I may, is just making sure, again, we talk about making sure that we create the right spaces for these individuals to be authentic and be themselves and create that right environment. And the key point that Rachel sort of mentioned was about talking. And talking and advocating for the trans community is so important and so impactful. Be that on your social media accounts, be that in the imagery that you're using, but also internally. Opening those doors to conversation. And what's really important for us at Legal and General is having these compelling conversations. That's why we're so proud to partner with you today to bring this conversation through Legal and General and bring it out to the industry, right? Because it's got to start somewhere. And Rachel said this years ago, and I remember this because it sticks with me every single time. She spoke about being that pebble that makes a difference. And I remember her saying, be that one pebble that creates the ripple, because that ripple will create change. And that always resonates with me. And each one of us today needs to do something and be that pebble to help make a difference for the trans and non-binary community. So think about what you can do as allies, and even businesses, whether it's lobbying Parliament or just actively changing or reviewing your policies internally, but creating that right environment or fostering an environment internally that makes a difference for the trans and non-binary community. Great.
Yeah, some really good points there. And I know allyship is a continuing theme within the industry, and there's going to be obviously an exciting event that you're involved with as well, I think coming up in May with Interinvest, which is going to explore the theme of intersectional allyship. So please do watch out for sort of the sign-up links for that, and we're looking forward to supporting that with you. Jack, I know we've obviously had a heap of questions come through. Could we make sure that we've got all of those documented, and what we can then do is create some responses, and actually with the follow-up email, and we can jot down some ideas for everybody, because we've had such a great conversation that we potentially have not got to some of the questions that we would ordinarily do so.
Yes,
but,
just like to say thank you for all the questions, and apologies for time, we can't get through to all of them, but we will look to share some thoughts after.
Circulate. Yeah, and have a great Transgender Day of Visibility, and please do like and share posts. There's a lot of content going out of our social media channels today, so please feel free to show your support and to amplify some of those. And yeah, we look forward to building the conversation, as we move ahead with our programme. And a special thank you to Dion, Michael, and the team at LNG, for partnering with us on this event today. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Hopefully we'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.